A few weeks ago, Zach Polanski went on Rory Stewart's show, The Rest is Politics, and it's fair to say that Rory was uncharitable to Zach.
How much are we paying debt interest?
So here's the question.
How much are we spending every year on debt interest?
Well, we don't need to, do we?
How much are we spending
Borrowing
every
from
year?
yourself.
No,
so who are you borrowing from?
I'm just trying to work out how good you are on the numbers. How much are we spending every year on debt interest?
But so actually, of all people, Rich Tice has been saying the same thing. During COVID, we gave loans to the Bank of England.
You can't give me a rough figure on how much we're spending on debt interest every year?
Well, there's £70 billion that we owe to the Bank of England, but we don't actually owe that money.
You mean the debt or the deficit?
The debt.
Okay, the debt is
the deficit, sorry.
Okay, we are spending £100 billion annually on debt interest, right?
Is it 11% of everything?
Debt interest, huge amount of money.
Right.
So one of the things I suppose I'm getting at
but what I'm getting straight back at you is we don't need to spend that money. So that money has been created as an idea. We're spending that money straight back to ourselves.
This is my point about the change. Is that we do need to spend that money now because that is how we borrow the money from the markets to fund the things that we're funding.
Now, we don't have to spend through markets. Like, that's a choice that our governments have made over the past 15 years. There's other ways to approach it. But on the wider point, Zach quite obviously slips up and then corrects himself on the difference between deficit and debt. But then, later on in the show, Rory acts like Zach just didn't know the difference.
He doesn't know the difference in deficit. Right, just to explain for most listeners, right, just in case other people are not. And so, am I being rude to listeners in having to explain this? I presume most of our listeners know, right? The debt is the total amount you've borrowed. The deficit is the amount you're adding to it every year. Thinking that our debt is 70 billion rather than our deficit is underestimating the scale of our debt about 15-fold.
It's not your listeners you're being rude to, Rory. It's Zach you were rude to. After that uncharitable showing, many people pointed out that Rory Stewart was just very dismissive without much good reason. Stewart got himself in trouble, of course, with Gary Stevenson as well, who he assumed didn't have proper economic qualifications. I'd say there's probably a level of classism there. And another thing was the gotcha questioning. Now, I've been on GB News a fair bit now, and in my research about like media training, this is something that it always comes up. Gotcha questions are basically a way to trick someone into looking ignorant by using niche information, withholding information from them, and then making them feel stupid for not being able to answer every question. And there's a reason that generally we don't do this, right? Now, I'm not criticising Zach at all, but it's perfectly legitimate to say that you're not going to play pub quiz with your interviewer. That's not why you're there. It doesn't show good knowledge to just regurgitate information, regurgitate numbers. You don't want somebody just regurgitating numbers at you. That's not helpful. The same kind of problem exists in exam culture, where people can memorize things and your ability to be able to memorize things is mistaken for good analysis. They're not the same thing. Sometimes what I'll say when I'm faced with this sort of interviewer is, I've got a feeling that you're going to tell me and I don't want to risk getting it wrong. Just be honest with them. Because eventually they'll ask you too many questions and you will trip up. It's inevitable. But another approach you could do is having your own gotcha questions. For example, Zach could have clapped back by asking how much billionaire wealth has increased by over that same period in the past 10 years, 15 years. There's different approaches, I think, to refocus the conversation. But the main point is that Rory's approach is uncharitable. I could sit here and ask Harriet questions about the economy that I've prepared, and eventually she would get one wrong, no matter how well she'd prepared, because we all would. Like, I would as well. But the interviewer is cheating because they know the answers to the questions beforehand. Like, Rory Stewart could well have sat there and only ever memorised those two pieces of information in his life about the economic situation and asked Zach those questions, and still made Zach look silly for not knowing the answers. It's just a bad way of going about questioning an interviewee, because it targets the memorization of facts and figures rather than the analysis, and the analysis is always kind of the more interesting thing. But I don't think, from the way that Rory approached the interview, I don't think Rory was interested in having a genuine conversation about alternative ways of viewing the economy. Economist James Meadway, however, has appeared on Zach Polanski's podcast Bold Politics this week, and a clip has been released where he claps back at Rory Stewart for the way he approached this interview.
I went on The Rest is Politics and we had an economic conversation. I think the bit that hasn't been told is The Rest is Politics said to me very specifically, we're going to record pre-budget, we're going to put out after budget. So we're not going to talk about the budget. And this is going to be an evergreen interview. I knew I was going into a conversation about being gay, about being bullied at school, about anti-Semitism, about that kind of more emotional storytelling thing. So that was very much what I was prepped for. And then when the interview ended, I said to Rory, if you told me we were going to talk about economics, I could have learnt those numbers and it would have been a less interesting interview. I'm an actor and I would have just been firing off numbers at you. I don't think that was the best way to do an interview. And then obviously when it finished and I'd left the room, he bastardized that story to say, oh, I said it was unfair because I was an actor, and that's not quite how it went. Now, having said all of that, I do hold my hands up that as a politician, you kind of got to be ready for any question. And so I will absolutely go away and memorize numbers like £3 trillion of the national debt, and 95% is the debt to GDP ratio. But I have a wider question, like how helpful is it to treat politicians like spreadsheets where we just remember numbers and churn them out, and then that's for political conversation?
It's not remotely helpful. I mean, I have to say, I think this whole business of like, you drag someone in and they chant out numbers at you, numbers that don't really mean anything. By the time you're talking about billions of pounds, this is not a number that means very much. It's way beyond anything any of us can really conceptualise on a day-to-day basis. They just sound big. The debt, you just did it, £3 trillion. Rory, I noticed, got that wrong, by the way.
He then thought that the debt was £70 billion, right? Which the debt is actually closer to £1 trillion.
You say it was £1 trillion, because this is the danger with this, by the way. You can always slip up. It doesn't matter. You can sit there looking all clever and maybe you've got a prepared sheet of numbers to interrogate on. But what are you actually getting out of that? What is anyone getting out of that?
Well, it's interesting because, again, Rory, I think on a podcast from last week said, ultimately, the conversation I was having with Zach Polanski is, do we want a bigger state or not? Yeah. And he was arguing against a bigger state. And I thought, well, we're really getting to the root of this now. Really what you're committing to there is austerity, whatever name that you call it. And it feels like that's at the heart of this argument.
These numbers get used to bash out and clear out of the way any other conversation we could have about the economy. Right? So why is the debt like this? Why is the deficit like this? That's the sort of question that's a bit more interesting, right? Why is it that the economy isn't working well? And it isn't really for most people. Loads of people paying more and more for their energy bills, but fossil fuel companies making their all-time record profits off the back of it, right? That's a better story than just, here's a number, it's really big, we better do austerity, because that's what we had for like 15 years now in various different forms.
I occasionally run into right-wing libertarians who, that's often called ANCAPs, people who don't believe that we should have any state whatsoever and capitalism should just be allowed to do its thing. The state should be as minimal as possible, just enforcing property rights. And part of the problem with ANCAPs is that, of course, they don't understand the role the state plays in securing currency, in making sure that there is a stable market for private businesses to operate on, and in securing disputes between, being a resolver of disputes between individuals. There's a reason you can't just what's the term? Send everything out to to like private security companies. You can't have arbitration done by everybody's hired security company, because my hired security company is not going to be as good as Jeff Bezos's hired security company. But what I'm getting at is that right-wing libertarians, of course, don't see the role the state plays. I think people like Rory Stewart are along that spectrum. They're just not as far along that spectrum. I think Rory Stewart views the state as a passive regulator of the market, designed to serve the market rather than an active participant in the economy. And I think the state is an active participant in the economy. Now, I'm a big fan of Mariana Mazzucato and her book, The Entrepreneurial State, where she argues that the state should be an active participant in the economy. Now, Mazzucato isn't a modern monetary theorist, but takes some of the principles of MMT as long as like the investment is driven towards missions or large aspirational projects that will have long-term benefits. Indeed, the state can make long-term investments to drive growth that a private business actually can't. The primary purpose of a private business is to get a return on investment for shareholders. That's their only primary purpose in most cases. They need profit. They can't invest in projects that might take a decade to come to fruition. So their potential to stimulate growth is limited compared to the state. The state doesn't have such limitations beyond the need to manage inflation, gilt yields, interest rates, and a few other things that the state has to take account of in economic terms. The state is a more dynamic tool. It's not one that you simply sell off to pay back investors in the short term. If you have a small state, you have a disastrous society in a lot of ways. But in a lot of ways, I'm also interested in the nature of the state. Who does it serve? Who is the big government being made made to serve? And I think this story is part of the history too. Having these big stories told by the state in the way that we are spending is part of the history. It's always worth remembering that the very technology you're using to watch me on right now was built by state investment in the space race. As Matsukato says, nearly all the technological revolutions in the past, from the internet to today's green tech revolution, required a massive push by the state. Silicon Valley's techno-libertarians might be surprised to find out that Uncle Sam's funded many of the innovations behind the information technology revolution. The iPhone is often heralded as the quintessential example of what happens when a hands-off government allows genius entrepreneurs to flourish, and yet the development of the features that make the iPhone a smartphone rather than a stupid phone was publicly funded. The iPhone depends on the internet. The progenitor of the internet was ApparaNet, a program funded in the 1960s by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, which is part of the Defense Department in the US. The Global Positioning System, GPS, began as a 1970s US military program called Navistar. The iPhone's touchscreen technology was developed by the country Fingerworks, which was founded by a professor at the publicly funded University of Delaware and one of his doctoral candidates who received grants from the National Science Foundation and the CIA. Even Siri, the iPhone's cheery voice-recognizing personal assistant, can trace its lineage to the US government. It's a spin-off of a DARPA artificial intelligence project. Even AI ultimately comes from investment in the state. The state is an amazing participant in the economy when we allow it to be, and austerity simply hasn't worked. Looking at the debt interest, debt and deficit, looking at those figures and going, well, we have to cut back our spending and live within our means. It's bullshit. It just is. Cutting spending at the zero lower bound, that's the lowest part of the economy, the people with the least, is daft because it halts the circulation of money as consumers begin to cut back. 15 years of doing this has not worked. Why, Rory, would we keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results? Harriet, what did you make of how Zach was treated and James's response?
Ben, I just want to say one thing before we get started. I really worry for people who genuinely enjoy the rest is politics. I've literally got one of the architects of a disastrous illegal war and a former Tory MP who voted for austerity measures time and time again, laundering their reputation as cosy podcast dads and raking in the cash with this product. Why do people give it their time? Literally. I mean, Rory Stewart, you know, when you said Zach could have clapped back at him by saying, oh, how much has billionaire wealth gone up then? How about Zach said to Rory Stewart, why did you predict with all certainty that Kamala Harris would win the 2024 US election? Why have you been saying that Prince Andrew's alleged behaviour with Epstein victim Virginia Giuffre, now sadly deceased, needs to have like less focus and scrutiny on it because it happened before 9/11 and apparently there are more pressing issues now? Like, Zach was very controlled. He did not ask Rory Stewart about anything like that. He kept it totally warm. He was friendly. He asked the question. I'd have gone on the attack. Honestly, if they had treated me like that, I would have gone for the jugular. But just to go back to like that poor prediction that Rory Stewart made, which turned out to be disastrously incorrect, and the Prince Andrew thing, I think that Stewart has said on many occasions that he is an ardent monarchist, which is why he might feel the need to say that Prince Andrew's behaviour needs a bit less focus and scrutiny. What it comes back to is the fact that someone like Rory Stewart cannot read the room. He is totally out of touch, which is why he needs to rely on something like a gotcha line of questioning. He told Zach he was coming in to speak on some specific issues. And then if you watch that Rest of Politics episode, the bit they clip up for the intro, because it is the spiciest part in their view, is the gotcha bit on economics, where they're like, oh, Zach doesn't know what he's talking about. He got something wrong. He misspoke and he got the number wrong on what government debt is. They got what they wanted out of it. Journalistically, that's the most interesting part.
And that's the interesting thing. He didn't even get the number wrong, because what he said was he gave a specific figure about the Bank of England. Like, he didn't actually go for the directly answer Rory Stewart's question. And you can criticize him for that if you like, but it does sort of like get into the if you start answering, the problem is when you're in this situation, and I know because I've been in the situation, not with them obviously, with the GB News interviewers. If you start answering questions or start guessing the answers to questions, the danger is that they'll just keep asking you questions until you slip up, and you of course will slip up. But it's not even really a gotcha, because it's not a good gotcha, I should say. It's obviously meant as a gotcha. Yeah, because...
But they certainly thought it was, because they used it as the initial clip to lead into their episode. And then Stewart didn't know what he was talking about either, because he got the trillion figure wrong. It should have been 3 trillion, as James Meadway said.
Yeah, yes. I also think it's really disingenuous to hear somebody talk about, to hear somebody say deficit, and then assume that means that they don't know the difference between the two. Like I just think it's so uncharitable to do that. But another question I was going to ask you, and I have got to keep an eye on the time. Do you think there's a path out of this economic orthodoxy that normalises austerity and allows people like Rory Stewart to just passively not think about what they're doing or saying, and not critically examine the way that our state and our economy runs, and just sort of, they're allowed to just sort of like go on without thinking, because they can dismiss any ideas outside of the neoliberal orthodoxy? Do you think there's a path out of that?
Well, there has to be, or else what's the point of anything that we're doing here? Literally, what is the point? Austerity was a political choice, and it has created much greater costs down the road in terms of people's health outcomes and their life chances. It has decimated communities up and down this country. It was not the only choice. It was one of many choices, and it was what the Tory Lib Dem coalition government decided to go with. But for people like Rory Stewart, who've shown a very vast and unpleasant level of snobbery when it comes to people like Gary Stevenson, and then again to Zach Polanski, Stewart's a one nation Tory, and one nation Tories tend to want to keep things how they are because it's working quite well for them. You notice this in the responses of literally everyone in legacy media and in the political sphere. Is someone like Sophie Ridge or Laura Koonsberg, or even someone who I have quite a lot of time for, Victoria Derbyshire, or Stewart or Alistair Campbell, are they going to really give the space to alternative paths of thought or rigorously question the prevailing orthodoxy on this stuff? They've got an investment in changing it because they are not affected. They are fine as they are. It's working for them. They are in the 1 to 5% of uber privileged people whose lives are not being trashed by this economic order that's sucking every penny out of our pockets and making the life chances of ourselves and our kids so much worse. I absolutely back the idea of wealth taxes. I think we should equalise capital gains tax and income tax. A particularly egregious example from 2023 was that someone receiving 60k a year in the form of capital gains or dividends was paying less tax than someone in a job earning 35k a year. I mean, how is that fair? How is that allowed to happen? I think that, James Meadway's Bold Politics episode and his answers are really interesting and worth listening to. Like, he is actually an economist and far more clued up on this stuff than me. And his stuff on like how to handle the bond market so we don't end up in another Liz Truss situation. And I strongly feel that bond markets should not be dictating the democratic decision-making process. But Meadway talks about how to manage them so that investors in British assets don't just dump them. And And I think that this is incredibly important because Liz Truss is now used as like this terrifying, monstrous scare figure by the Labour government, and they can like lock in with their ironclad fiscal rules and say that nothing must ever change because we don't want to have a Liz Truss event. I mean, applying it to anyone who wants to do something economically different means that it's a bit of a stick to beat the Tories with. Yes, great, but it also stops us doing anything that's different or radical. And I think Meadway lays out quite well the way that we can get around this and actually do it.